So welcome everyone who's joining us for part 3 of our 3-part program of New Yiddish and Klezmer Music. I'm Mark Kligman, director of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. And I bring you greetings from us at UCLA, as well as Josh Horowitz, pardon me, as well as Alex Weiser. Alex Weiser is the public program director at YIVO, and through UCLA and YIVO, we're jointly bringing you this program. It gives us great pleasure to share with you the North American premiere of a Yiddish opera called Bas Sheve, written by Henekh Kon. And we have 4 people with us today who were instrumentally involved in making sure that this production came to the Ashkenaz Festival. So I'd like to briefly introduce the people who will be speaking tonight, and then we'll start our program by playing a brief clip. So Josh Horowitz, who's a klezmer musician, part of Aretsky Pass and many other programs, and teacher of music and composer, is with us tonight, as well as a famed Yiddish linguist, Michael Wex, who is a part of this production, which we'll hear about. We welcome Michael, as well as Eric Stein, who's the director of the Ashkenaz Festival, and my colleague at UCLA, Neal Stulberg, who's the director of orchestras at UCLA and a professor of music. So we welcome our panelists for today. We really look forward to talking about Bas Sheve, and thank all of you for joining us. And to begin, we're going to play an opening clip of the program. And Neal, do you want to just give us any words about the opening?
You have to unmute.
Neal, you're muted.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Yeah, we've prepared a couple of clips from one of the 3 performances in Toronto. The first clip is very brief. It's just a portion of the overture to this piece. And of course, the piece was only written in a piano vocal score back in 1924, but Josh Horowitz orchestrated it as well as completed it with Michael Wex. So this is just a little bit, about a minute or so of the very opening.
Wonderful. So we thank you for playing the introduction. Did you want to play another clip, or should we? So okay, so we'll move on first. And I was remiss to say, and just want to also add, that the Ashkenaz Festival, through the direction of Eric, is a co-sponsor for today's program. So we thank Ashkenaz for that, and Eric Stein's entrepreneurship and spirit and creativity really helped make this production possible. So we'll hear more about that. So to get us into the history of this work and what this work is, I just want to turn it over to Josh Horowitz. So welcome, Josh. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about this opera, how it was rediscovered, and put us in the context of it.
Okay, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you all for organizing this. As far as I know, and this is with the help of Beth Kramer, the manuscript was bought in an auction by Yale University, the Gilmore Music Library, somewhere around 2006 from Hanania Goldman at the Antique Judaica Books and Manuscripts. I think that resides in Israel. And it was kind of auctioned off, bought by them, retrieved by Professor Diana Matut in Halle, Württemberg, Germany. And she sent me then the original manuscript, and said she wanted it to be performed in the festival for Weimar in 2019, which was the 100th year anniversary of the Weimar Republic, and was given very little time to do it. Noticed that there were 16 pages missing in the manuscript, in a place that was formidably and thankfully probably the climax of the opera, which meant it would be the most fun to orchestrate and to also to write. So we enlisted then the talents of Michael Wex to fashion a text that I could then set in that part, with very little discussion, as I remember, with Wex. My trust in him being complete. So once I got, well, actually, I was even working on the music of those sections prior to Wex even entering with a text, just because we had so little time. I think probably 16 weeks of actual working time on the orchestration. And it was a pleasure to do it. The piece, as was said, was performed in 1924 in Warsaw, only with piano, a choir, the Moshe Schnur choir, and Henekh Kon himself, the composer, singing the bass part. Apparently he had a good voice, played the piano and sang the bass part. They apparently just was not well enough funded for him to have either an orchestra or complete orchestration himself, or or even I don't think even subsequent performances. But it was hailed as a great opera, and probably the only one at that time that was in Yiddish. So it has a historical importance. It's debatable whether we consider it to be a masterpiece in the greater arena of grand operas, but we did a lot of work on it and orchestrating it. And the piece that you just heard, the overture, was, I would say, kind of sparely written. It wasn't the best part of the opera. I added some of the cascading water effects and the very beginning of a kind of a feeling of water cascading over Bas Sheve as David watches her bathing or showering, just as little effects that Kon might have written had he had the time. And so there are some things that are inserted into the score itself, but mostly I respected the details of the score without adding too much until my own compositions.
Thank you very much, Josh, and we'll hear a little more about it. So I want to bring into the conversation next for Michael Wex to just briefly talk about what his work was with this production. So welcome, Michael.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's pretty much what Josh has just described. Let me try and restart my video. Yeah, as Josh has just described it. I'm not sure at what point Josh and Diana had got in working on this when I was first contacted. I got an email from Diana Matut saying something or other about, the opera Bas Sheve. And I wrote back to her and saying, you can say whatever you like about the opera because nobody's ever seen it. And apparently it's been lost forever. She said, no, I have it. So she sent me a copy. And again, the first thing I noticed, much like Josh, was it builds and builds and builds. And then there's about 16 pages missing. We know exactly what's the number of pages missing just by following the pagination, the numbers on the manuscript. Generally doing something like this, where everybody knows the story, so there's not a great deal of wiggle room for editions, etc. Fortunately, or maybe not, the manuscript broke off at precisely the same point as the Bible breaks off. So if you look at the biblical account of all of this in Samuel, David goes to sleep, then he gets up to news that the child that he had conceived with Bas Sheve has died. So the manuscript breaks off where he goes to sleep, and then we've got to fill up 16 pages. So I at least had the freedom to add something new. What might have been there originally, we have absolutely no idea. So based on research I had done, research that Josh had done in classical Jewish sources, etc., we tried to come up with something that would fit both what was the opera itself and satisfy the demands of the biblical narrative. The only other thing, as Josh was saying, he'd already started working on the music, because I wrote him saying, do you have music? Is it ready? Is there something I can write to? Or are you going to tailor the music to the libretto, to the lyrics? And he just said, write whatever you want and we'll figure out some way to make it fit. And that's more or less what we did. It wasn't quite as haphazard as I might be making it sound, but that's how we did it. And as he said, with very little back and forth, because we simply didn't have the time for it.
Thanks, Michael. We'll hear more about your contribution shortly. And I next want to invite Eric Stein from the Ashkenaz Festival just to talk about how the work got to his attention and how it came to be part of Ashkenaz.
Hello.
So Eric, you're with us. Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know. I can't turn on my video, but maybe somebody else can. Here we go. Start my video. Okay. So sorry, the question was, how did this get to Toronto? Is that correct?
How did this get to your attention? And then just tell us the background of getting it.
So I first heard about the production in the late summer of 2019, shortly after it had been staged for the first time in Germany as part of the Yiddish Summer Weimer Festival. And right away, I was really intrigued to learn more about it. It just sounded super unique and interesting. And the process through which the work had been rediscovered and revived was particularly interesting to me. So later that fall, on something of a whim, I applied for a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts for us to do a production of this opera in Toronto. And a couple months later, the pandemic began and everything went off the rails. And then a few months after that, we got this notification that we got this grant. And at that point, I just thought, how the hell are we going to do this production? How are we ever going to do this production? Because it seemed like we were just deep in the middle of you know what at that point in time. But when we came around to the fall of 2021, and things had obviously significantly improved, and live events were coming back tentatively, we started to plan in earnest for doing this. And one of the key things I forgot to mention there is that when the grant that we applied for, it was for a foreign an international collaboration between a Canadian organization and international ones. And so I contacted Yiddish Summer Weimer, of course, because they were the ones that had originated the production, the reproduction. And then I contacted the Milken Center at UCLA because I thought you guys would be interested in the project, and you were. And so we sort of, right from the beginning, approached it as a three-way partnership between those three organizations, and that's how it went off mostly all the way down the line. And so when we got into actually planning for this, we had to solve a lot of questions in terms of who the actual performing personnel were going to be. Our initial vision was to have an equal representation of each of the three countries that were involved, Canada, US, and Germany. That became a little less feasible in the context of COVID and post-COVID because travel was such a problem and health restrictions and all that kind of thing. So we ended up eventually coming up with this plan that we would have the UCLA Philharmonia come to Toronto and be the orchestra for the performances. We would have all of our soloists come from Toronto, and we added a third element to the production, which was not part of the initial reproduction of it, which was to create animations, projections that would play during the show. And part of the calculation there was just thinking about if it's an opera, you sort of want to have staging of some kind. And rather than it just being a simple oratorio style concert, let's try to tell the story visually for anybody in the theater while this is going on. And we ended up enlisting an animator named YIVO Lapsker, who was in Germany, and she became the sort of artistic representative of Germany within this production. And she developed these really compelling animations, sort of modeled, sort of Monty Python style 2D art type thing. But it ended up being, in my opinion, one of the really interesting and unique aspects of the way we staged this in Toronto. And you know, in addition to obviously all the great performances and Neal's fantastic work conducting and leading the ensemble and all the great soloists, I was really interested in how those animations came off. I wonder, maybe is this a good time to maybe look at a quick clip of those animations? Does somebody have that?
Oh, why don't we let Neal, bring Neal in first, and then we can.
Sure, fair enough.
All right, great. So thank you, Eric. So Neal Stulberg, who spent a great deal of time working with this material to really bring it to life in this particular version. Just wanted to say on our end at UCLA, we also want to thank Dr. Lori Black, who couldn't be here because he's currently on leave with a brand new baby, which we wish him a mazel tov. He was very instrumental in helping us, as well as Beth Kramer in the organizational capacities to get things working. But Neal, I want to turn it over to you to talk about your, artistic vision and efforts to work on Bas Sheve.
Sure. Before I forget, I'd also like to just put in a quick mention of another colleague of ours, Nate Ben Horan, who was the Toronto-based repetiteur and choral director, and also the man who assembled our four soloists. So this was an intriguing project for me. My knowledge of Yiddish was rudimentary, although I have some German and some Hebrew. When I got the materials, I was very excited about this, and we quickly assembled a kind of all-star 21-piece orchestra from UCLA. We rehearsed a little bit in Los Angeles before we went to Toronto, and then when we got to Toronto, began working with soloists and chorus, which was based, the chorus and soloists were based in Toronto, and put this all together. I think it's a remarkably fascinating and worthwhile piece and realization. I didn't really know what to think at the beginning, but when we heard audience reactions to the performances in Toronto, they were ardent. They were emotional. They really felt that this was something of lasting value and should have a life. Should be performed in Warsaw. Should be performed in Vienna. And I hope that we'll be able to also perform it in Los Angeles at some point in the near future. Stylistically, as Josh can explain better, the piece is an amalgam of styles. It is largely in an accessible language musically, vocally very gratifying for the soloists, thematically well integrated. And as I said before, the orchestrations really enhanced the effect of the music. And as you'll hear a little bit later, Josh's music towards the end, which really did not make an attempt at verisimilitude, let's say, but yet certainly reflected back on Kon's music, but kind of shot it up into the present in a very stimulating way. Audience really reacted beautifully to that, as well as Eric said, to these wonderful visuals. So, Mark, you're going to have to give me a second if I'm going to show the visuals, because I don't have them queued up here. So I'll hand it back to you if you'd like.
Okay, all right, very good. So while we queue up the visuals, that's probably a good next place to start, is to play a segment so people can see the visuals and know how that worked. And then we can go a little further into the work and play various sections of it. So Neal, if you need a couple more minutes, maybe Eric, do you want to talk a little more about the visual artist and the contributions visually?
Sure. I'll let somebody else controlling my video turn me on. Well, so YIVO Lapsker, I guess she consulted with Diana Matut in Germany, as well as with Josh Horowitz, to think about how to represent the story of the opera in a way that felt appropriate, and that's turning on the video, and we'll see that in some of the clips that we're going to see in a moment. There was just a couple other acknowledgements I should make. I was talking about the Canada Council grant being the thing that got this going, but it was certainly not the end of it, because we needed quite a bit more resources to make it happen. And the Azrieli Foundation came in with a very generous contribution, as well as the Toronto Workmen's Circle Foundation and the Glenn Gould School at the Royal Conservatory here in Toronto. And without those funders, there's no way this project would have happened. And of course, UCLA's contributions were quite significant in order to make this project happen. Neal, you got stuff queued up? All right, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, give me 2 seconds and we'll show it. It's just a 30-second clip, but it'll give you just a little bit of a taste of it.
Wonderful. Thank you for letting us see how that worked out with the animations. Neal, do you want to queue up the next video that you wanted to show and just walk us or bring us into the narrative of the story and tell us what's happening so we can start encountering parts of Bas Sheve. So maybe while you're doing that, does someone, maybe Michael, do you want to give us just an overview of the story of Bas Sheve, who the characters are?
Sure. In case you're not familiar with it, it's pretty straightforward. As I said before, it's right out of the Bible. King David is strolling on his rooftop garden one day, looks down, and next door in her own rooftop is a woman taking a bath. And he is smitten with her and has her sent for, and this of course is Bas Sheve. And they do whatever King David wants them to do together. But of course, she's a married woman. And this is a bit of a problem when she conceives of child. Now, her husband, Uriah the Hittite, is a captain, as it were, in David's army. He's trying to figure out how they're going to avoid the adultery problem here with Bas Sheve being pregnant. So he tells his general, as David tells the general, "Oh, next battle, put Uriah right up at the front of the line, so that he will stand a very good chance of being killed in battle. That way he doesn't have to commit murder himself." And this is what happens. Uriah gets killed. Bas Sheve then, sort of moves into the palace or whatever. She is pregnant. Nathan the prophet comes to King David, and he knows about this, and he gives him a parable about a poor man who had only one sheep, and he loved the sheep, etc. And it was like the center of his life. Meanwhile, a rich man came along who had many sheep and took this guy's sheep. And Nathan says, "What would you do?" Because, the king is also the chief justice. "What would you do in such a case?" And David says, "Guy did that, he deserves to die." And Nathan says, "You are that guy." It says in the Bible, "You are the man." David feels bad but doesn't know what to do. He falls asleep. Then there's a dream sequence in the opera, which is the Bible. On awakening, he finds out that the child is dead. So this is sort of the penance that he undergoes. And eventually, he and Bas Sheve make everything nice and legal. She has another child who is Solomon, who then, in his turn, becomes king. And I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you. So Neal, do you want to set up the first clip that you'll show with Nosson?
Yes. This is towards the beginning of the opera, and it introduces two characters, Nosson the prophet, or Nathan, and a character called Shaliach, the messenger, who in the original story plays a completely incidental role, but in Kon's and Broderzone's version, Broderzone being the librettist, the Shaliach is a kind of comic character. So the very brief translation here of what you're about to hear is the following. Nosson says, "I will interrupt his song of victory," meaning David, "the song of his tent. The king has sinned. The king with his power enfeebled has sinned. God watches." And then the chorus responds, "God watches, Gott wacht. His sentence is just." Nosson continues, "Oh, help me God, the admonishment must be much harsher than the punishment itself." And then Shaliach comes in basically complaining. He's a big complainer, he's a big tattler, he's everything you don't want a Shaliach to be. he says, the king can't sleep a wink and won't let me rest. And then he goes on in a sort of comic vein, talking about how he's a poor messenger, and you know, the lot of a messenger. So here is this segment of the opera.
Thank you for sharing that clip. And just again, to let everyone know that, and maybe Josh can talk about this again a little more, is that all that really existed from what was rediscovered or what we thought was a lost opera was just a piano vocal score. So the orchestration choices are Josh's choices. And maybe Josh, you want to just talk about a little bit about some of your thoughts in light of what we just heard in terms of how you were trying to approach creating an ensemble sound for this work?
Sure. I mean, I was also subjected to the limitations of the first orchestra, which wasn't even completed as I was orchestrating it. So I started by using also the harp and even a horn section, which we then had to eliminate because it wasn't possible to contract them in Weimar. So it was orchestrating without knowing what the orchestration would be, what the final orchestra would be. But we figured it out. So it's a full orchestra minus horns. Also, the percussion parts weren't able to be performed in the original thing. Now, in the original manuscript, Kon gives a couple of, a handful of designations of what instruments that he wanted to perform a certain line. It's not enough to go on, but I respected virtually all of those. And so the parts, for instance, when we couldn't get the harp, I reorchestrated those to imitate the harp, for instance, by using strummed pizzicato in the string section, as well as violin harmonics to give it a high edge. And so that's always fun to do, to imitate other instruments. Even Wagner, was famous for doing that, and stole, by the way, from the Jewish composer Halevi's ability to imitate the organ through the use of the horns. So just an interesting aside in the history of orchestration. But so there were a lot of instances where, first of all, in orchestrating it, the first thing you need to do is to stay out of the way of the singers, but not to be afraid of doubling voices with them. So I tried to have a balance between staying out of their way and actually orchestrating with them, with the voices. So, you'll hear sometimes an oboe combined with the soprano or something like that. And as far as then the orchestration of the parts where I and Wex composed them, I chose to choose a slightly different style, or I added to the styles that Kon had originally chosen. As Neal said, the original styles kind of lean on a Baroque type of thing, but there's also most of it's kind of late romantic, high romantic music, and also modal music. There's a little bit of Yiddish theater gestures in it. And so I took his lead by going, well, gosh, if he's mixing all those styles, I'll add some of my own. So I kind of included a little bit of impressionism in a choral part, where I used a Moroccan piyut melody for the Yedid Nefesh poem, and orchestrated that in a very impressionistic way, I guess. And then also I used candomblé drum rhythms. These are like Brazilian rhythms, drum rhythms, in the part where it's supposed to represent the war in David's head, his guilt for sending Uriah to the front lines to be killed. So Wex, had this beautiful soliloquy that he sings, and the orchestra then is kind of imitating these drum rhythms that you'll hear, and also they have rocks that I was trepidatious about using the rocks just because it seems kind of a hokey choice, but I decided to use them because I like the sound of them so much, the clicking and clacking as war sounds, but also the kind of the symbolism of the rocks on a graveyard, on a Jewish graveyard. So I kept that in spite of my shyness about that. And so you hear this kind of war that's going on in David's head, represented by the other. So Uriah in the history, he is a Hittite, as Wex mentioned, meaning he was not Jewish. And some of the arguments in favor of David not committing adultery is that his marriage was not legal to Uriah Bas Sheve's marriage to Uriah was not legal because he was a Hittite and not a Jew. And so I kind of took that feeling of otherness and put it into the score in that particular scene, to kind of imitate the other. It doesn't even matter what other it could have been. It could have been anything. I just chose candomblé rhythms because I like the kind of polyrhythmic intertwining of those rhythms. So that dictated how I orchestrated. These are the composed parts. Other than that, there was some, I added the piano to the score, and also the celeste. I added that as well. Just I love that instrument. They're hard to come by, but I love the brightness of it. And also, the cliche of the celeste using for sleep scenes. There's a lot of sleep scenes in this. And that high kind of bell sound, of the childlike bell sound that you hear. I didn't shy away from that. It's a very Hollywood-esque type of thing to do, but it's got a tradition in the history of orchestration of bright sounds imitating childlike things and lullabies. So I kept with that tradition too. I didn't mind. So yeah, those were some of the decisions.
That's great. And I think as we could hear, that there's, it brings us into the period of time that this work is, certainly, but you're really adding other colorful components to it to help with the storytelling and provide an artistic base to it. I know we'll get to the rock chorus and to the original parts that you and Wex wrote a little later, but Neal, do you have another clip queued up for us and want to bring us into it?
I was actually thinking this would be a good time to show Josh's music.
Great.
So we're going to show a portion of this very dramatic war type of music, and then the area where David is coming to terms psychologically with this horrible, horrible thing that he's done. So here we go.
Thank you. That's certainly incredibly dramatic.
I don't know who's supposed to talk here, but I forgot that the chorus in the background is singing a niggin, a song that Cohen later wrote for the film The Dybbuk. And I use that as a kind of a prelude to his work. And just to say, the background music that you hear is a kind of a rotating series of chords, of augmented chords, that Cohen uses only once in the introduction, in the overture, and leaves off. He doesn't use that harmony anywhere else. Beside that, we have normal modal and tonal harmonies. Just in this place, we have this 2 measures of this chord that just kind of stuck out to me. And so I thought to myself, well, that's got to reappear at some point. I mean, that's like a hanging participle. We just have to use it. So I have it rotating round and round while David is going crazy, as a kind of a fever dream. And that's what you're hearing, this kind of rotating thing against the choir, then singing the niggin, not in its complete form, but in a skeletal way, kind of with these glissandi. Very creepy. And then David, I mean, I imagined it in those moments where you hear there's a lot of silence because the ghost of Uriah is disappearing, and he's beckoning him back. So we don't see the gesturing of the singer in this case because it's done oratorio style, but I'm imagining him reaching out his arms and it's just ever disappearing. And if you could see that in a staged way, I really looked at it visually, the way Wex had created the text. It just, the silence, this increasing amount of silence, but also with gesturing was what I imagined. So if it seems strange to you that there are these silences that just kind of go on and on, that's why that's the gesturing moments. And I thought, it's quite powerful to use silence where nothing is happening. I mean, as in grand pauses, the kind that you hear where there is no sound at all and this is like death itself. So to recreate that in a performance is not so easy. And to understand it, because it seems like simply nothing is happening, but it's this psychology of silence that I was looking for. And I remember, telling Neal, let's not be shy about the length of those silences. There are fermatas written there, meaning, and I would tell the singer, that in the nervousness, your adrenaline on the stage is going to shorten that amount of silence. So please work against that psychologically in your performance. Don't shy away from long silences. And I said to Neal, they can be as long as we can tolerate them. And let's increase that tolerance to the maximum point. Because, an audience sitting there, I don't know if you've ever noticed at the beginning of a talk of, a skilled performer who has a good sense of timing that can just stand in front of an audience and say nothing, eventually people will start laughing, because it's so unusual, and it starts to go in their own head when you do that. And so, the idea of putting an audience through that was something that was kind of, tickled my fancy, because I wanted that, like, wait, what's supposed to happen now? Or let's get into the headspace of Uriah. So seeing this as this whole thing as a psychological drama, that seemed appropriate to me because this story is not physically dramatic. We're told the story. It's not happening to us in front of our eyes up until the point where Wex and I constructed those extra scenes. Up until this point, they're talking about David's sin and his guilt. So it's not like we get to see all of the war and the rape scene and the whole thing. We don't have the benefit of that, which we both struggled with, I think, in setting this, because being told a story is very different from experiencing it. So that generated some of the.
Thank you, Josh.
Huh? Pardon me?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
I said thank you. And before we get to the next portion of the addition that you and Michael Wex made, Neal, do you want to talk a little bit about just musically, the creation of those dramatic moments?
Sure. The first thing I want to make sure that we mention is the names of 4 soloists who are emerging young Canadian soloists. 3 of them, I believe, are with young artists with the Canadian National Opera. So David was Jonah Spungen, Bas Sheve, Jacqueline Grossman, Nosson, Marcel D'Entremont, and Shaliach, Jeffrey Schellenberg. And they were really a pleasure to work with. Mark, before I speak, how much longer do we have in this session? Because I don't know if you wanted to leave some time for questions or when we're finishing.
Right. So I would like us to go maybe about another 10 minutes before we take questions.
Sure.
So maybe it would be good to move into that final excerpt.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll do it. To answer your question, there's something that's very special always about crafting something as a performer, first of all, in a concert with a living composer, but also kind of bringing to life something for the first time in the way that Josh had anticipated it in terms of the orchestration and things like that. And what I found was that, like so much music, what is on the page is it's not a cookbook, it's a skeleton. And certainly in the original of Kon's, many things are left unremarked on in terms of notation that a performer really has to try their best to understand and to fulfill in the performance. And so I'd like to think that we put together a performance that was operatic and flexible and dramatic. And this had to do with working very hard on meanings of the text, on diction, of course, and on all the normal values that go into performing anything, but in particular selling something which has not really been heard much before, and trying to do that in such a way that people realize its value. And I think we succeeded in doing that.
So before we play that final ending clip, is there anything maybe Josh and Michael want to say about what's going to happen?
I knew what the clip
So Michael,
was.
do you want to talk about?
Yeah, it's sort of as Josh was mentioning, up until this point, the entire production of everything has been in the past. There's a sudden abrupt change of tense going on here that has to bridge those two things, like the past and the present, at the same time as David has to come to some sort of awareness. There's been a great deal of rabbinic ink spilled in the last few thousand years defending his actions. In this case, the Talmud twists itself into knots, trying to figure out, why he was okay. And not all authorities have agreed with this at different times. But, one of the things that the Bible doesn't have, that really the story itself doesn't have, is King David feels remorseful. You get the impression the remorse has more to do with the fact that he's been caught than with what he's actually done. You know, nowhere in this opera or in the Bible or in the Medrash or anywhere else does anybody ever shed a tear for Uriah the Hittite, whose life was apparently just a plot point that is needed to get stuff moving in various texts. One of the things I wanted to do was take it not just into the present tense, but go from the outside into the inside, you know, to make it, as Josh said, you know, psychological. You know, what would really have been going on here, or what could we conceive might really be going on here? And it's the old, you know, it's like Humphrey Bogart at the end of Casablanca, you know, you're not going to, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life. And I sort of wanted that soon for the rest of your life moment to be what's coming out there, that sudden like, oh my God, what have I done? And how am I, you know, there's no way out of this. That's where I wanted King David to feel that he was. So pushed into that moral and ethical corner. I think I finished it.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, Josh, if you just want to maybe briefly comment on how you transitioned from being, you know, the supportive voice to Henekh Kon to being, you know, the composer of the final moments.
Not sure I understand the question, but I'll answer it anyway. When Diana Matut originally sent me that thing, I was relieved that when she said, do this in any style you want. You don't the commission is not to compose in Kon's style, but to have it be what she called a Kon Horowitz production, which was a little more than I needed. But I took that, and I just took that freedom without trying to take it too far. I don't know if anybody's heard Luciano Berio's orchestration of Schubert's finishing of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, but he goes, you know, very, very ethereal, very modern, completely out of the realm of Schubert's style, and almost as if, you know, you're putting plaster in between a statue that's been broken, but not trying to match the color. So that was the way that I saw it. And originally I had wanted to, given what Wex just said, which was perfect, I originally wanted to do it, to go really wild on it, in using the choir as a separate work to be the trial of David using the Talmudic sources, where they argue the things that Wex was talking about, the validity of Uriah and all that. And so that it would be like the Greek choir that doesn't only comment on each of the scenes that Kon has written, but also passes judgment on them, as if it were a trial, with the various rabbis that comment Talmudically in the Talmud, but done in a choral setting. So each, this was my original idea, was to implant these scenes after each of these moments that refer to the original story, like the questions of did he commit adultery, number one, was Uriah was their marriage legal, was he justified in sending him to the front lines, was he guilty of murder, and all of these things, like all of the points that you would put somebody on trial for would have been choral segments. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time to do that. I started it though, and with the choral movements, and those are just sitting somewhere. But so that was the idea though, that we would then make these. So when Wex came with those texts, that was a relief to me, because I didn't have to do that whole other work.
I mean, what you're describing is just incredible opportunities for staging of this, when and hoping that opportunity comes. So Neal, do you want to play this final clip for us, so we can, now that it's nicely set up?
Yes. So we haven't heard yet from Bas Sheve, the title character. And she doesn't have actually a lot of music in this piece, but what she does have is a hit of an aria that comes at the very, very end, which is a kind of aria of mourning for the lost child. And we're going to play a clip of the last stanza of that aria, followed by the very end of the opera, some of which you saw at the very beginning, but you'll understand how it all works together. So.
Well, we didn't get to hear the final applause. So let's all applaud. Applaud this wonderful, wonderful work. And thank you so much for taking us into the work, showing us parts of it. I know that there's a strong desire for another version of this, and we are really fortunate that we could give it a renewed and different life than it had even at the Yiddish Summer Weimar program, thanks to Eric's guidance and artistic direction to make that happen. I think now would be a wonderful time to see if anyone has any questions. There have been some questions in the chat about the music that Josh has been able to answer about some of the stylistic components. But if anyone has any questions, we have a few minutes.
Yes, I have a question.
You feel free to, so someone who's already, yeah, please, Nana Eckerman.
As a singer and diction coach, I'm very curious to hear a little bit more about the language. This was most fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. But I'm interested in the response of the singers to the Yiddish text. I know opera singers sing in many different languages, and the Yiddish is no different from any other language. But I'm interested in how they responded to the language, what dialect was used, if any, how it was dealt with the audience. And I gather there were only 3 soloists, is that correct?
4.
There were only 3, and plus the 4 plus the choir, right?
Right.
And the second question is there going to be any staged version of it rather than an oratorio version? Anyway, I'm just thrilled with this program. It's just wonderful. You were all so articulate and so interesting to hear the way this whole thing was reconstructed. But if you can talk a little bit more about the language, I would be more.
Sure. I'm happy to address that, Nan. The soloists were not really phased by the Yiddish. They started with all of them start with a very good foundation of German, of course. And although Yiddish has some peculiar differences, not just in terms of pronunciation, but also in terms of the elision of syllables into each other, which is, of course, quite different from the boxy character of German. But you know, we sort of worked this out together in terms of the dialect. I mean, I know this is a very sort of complicated issue. You know, Litvak and Galicianer and all the rest of it. We sort of did our best with that, and Nate, the fellow who was the coach, had done quite a lot of research about it. Whether we succeeded in consistency or not, I'm not quite sure. The chorus, you know, also just took to it without a great deal of difficulty, which is it's a wonderful thing to know for the future, that singers who are not familiar with the language, you know, are able to continue to perform works in Yiddish, you know, well. I'll leave it to my colleagues about the staging.
I'd like to refer to Wex there, but just before that, Diana Matut in the original, the first time that we did it in Weimar and Łódź, Poland, spent a week with the singers, drilling them, tormenting them in the diction of Yiddish and how it differs from spoken Yiddish when you're singing it. The oys, whether if you go oy or often, all those kind of things. The difficulty in Yiddish and German, and probably one of the reasons why most singers prefer Italian, is that the many words end in consonants in Yiddish and in German, and that makes it presents its own problems. And Italian has the open vowels at the end of things, so it's a much more conducive language to lyric opera. Anyway, Wex, you probably talk about the.
Yeah, well, the language throughout, both in Moshe Broderson's original libretto and in what I added, would pass as straight YIVO Klalsprach, or standard language. This was how all Yiddish high culture was done at the time. It's not that they couldn't do it. Brodersen, if you're familiar with the comedy team Jigan and Schumacher, in Yiddish, who were renowned for their use of dialect. They did much of their stuff in Lodge dialect. That was Brodersen's contribution to their act. They too had been performing standard stage Yiddish and getting nowhere. So Brodersen, who was kind of the Noel Coward of interwar Yiddish performance and literature, Brodersen was the one who told them, like, do the dialect. But for something like this is Shanghai culture. You know, this is the Yiddish opera. It's, you know, when Diana first wrote me, she said, Yiddish opera, she didn't have to tell me which one she was talking about. This is the one that proves you can write an opera in Yiddish. I saw a question come up about, were there any others? Brodersen left behind a libretto for another opera. There's no indication of music of any sort. It was clearly never produced. We don't know anything about why it wasn't produced, or anything like that. So this is the only Yiddish opera that was ever produced. And to get into questions of dialect when you're reaching with this, I mean, I find it odd that in both the major productions, and this is not the fault of, got nothing to do with anybody bringing the stuff in, but both in Weimar and in Toronto, the librettist was in the same city and was never consulted once about any of this. So I think there was at least a tendency towards improvisation. And again, you can hear in the soloists, and I'm not criticizing their performances, which were uniformly fantastic, but some of the Yiddish is a little closer to German than some of the other Yiddish. And this has to do with the soloists themselves rather than with anything that might be found in the libretto.
Josh, do you want to answer the other part of, and thank you for your question, Nan, of Eve Sinclair's question about the work with the Dybbuk, if you're aware?
Who's that question for?
For you, Josh. Just in case you.
I couldn't find anything in the Dybbuk that he was using before. The Dybbuk happens in 1937, and this is in 1924. The music for this is for my ears, much more sophisticated than what he uses in the Dybbuk. I didn't see anything except his general style that was similar to that. Like I said, he's leaning very much on classical, Baroque and classical opera. Really a lot of Baroqueisms, and like I said, there's a paraphrase of Samson and Delilah in there, the Bacchanal. And I wrote an article on the whole thing, my analysis of it with commentary. And it hasn't been published yet. It's going to be in the proceedings of the Weimar Symposium from 2018. But I'm happy to post that, where it talks about the influences in the chat if you want. It's a Word file. Is that something that I can do, Beth and
can I just can I speak for a second? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there was I was asking about the stage production of the Dybbuk that preceded 1924, because I've always wondered whether the 1937 movie, which we know Kon was the composer, was he at all associated with the Warsaw stage production that was started in the early 20s and then of course famously ran for years and years. I don't know if anyone knows what the music was in that stage production, but personally, I do hear, when I listen to the overture that I know you adapted from his piano score, I definitely hear some things which are in a couple of Dybbuk scenes that I'm familiar with, but only those scenes.
Well,
also Josh, not you, Josh, but Josh Waletsky cleaned up the audio on another on that quasi documentary that Kon did the music for, and found these incredible inside instrumentations that we both think are close to Dybbuk. But anyway, that's like him reusing his own material just a year later.
Well, Eve,
in
I'd
the
love
30s.
to get more information on that. If you could somehow provide that to me, because
Yeah, after
that sounds
Yiddish New
fascinating.
York is over and Joshua Letsky has more time, we should totally talk about that.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. Thanks for that.
But nobody knows about the stage 1920s music from the Dybbuk. That's interesting because it was such a famous production, but I guess, we just don't know. Okay.
I don't know, but
Thank you.
Alex just wrote in the chat something, and Neal wants to say something.
Yeah, only that you asked Eve about other collaborations of theirs. Actually, they did collaborate on a film in 1937 that was made right after the Dybbuk, a comedy, actually, that was called a musical comedy called Jolly Paupers in English. Brodersen wrote the screenplay, Kon wrote the music. It's about an hour long, about the same as
Right.
the opera.
And the Yiddish title is Freiliche Kapsonim, and it's really interesting. It's very low budget, but the music is great.
Yeah, and actually my sort of idea, if we bring this to LA, is to do a kind of grand multi-hour presentation that would involve the opera, maybe dinner, and then a showing of this film, kind of like You Think You Know Rodgers and Hammerstein. Well, how about Brodersen and Kon?
On that note, Susan Gould has a question asking about vowels in Polish versus Russian Yiddish. Is that a further question you'd like to ask, Susan? If not, Josh, do you have any, Michael, any Polish versus Russian Yiddish?
Well, yes, Polish I or Russian I. I'm sorry, I can't see the whole comment here. Just a sec, I'll call it up. Okay, this question, it's not a matter of whether you say Shane or Shine, which one is right. It has more to do with where you come from or where your forebears came from. Also, Russians don't say Schoin and Breut. The Russians, Litvikists, don't say Schoin and Breut, they say Shane and Breit. They say Shane even for Schoin. This is one of the reasons why high culture tends to come out in something approaching Klalsprach or in the stage dialect, the standard stage dialect of Yiddish, which was based on Volhynian Yiddish, which was not widely spoken because Volhynia was mostly full of forests, but it was very clear and everyone could understand it. The problem with choosing these dialects for anything, and this is one of the reasons why a standard language was developed in the 1920s, was you had things of, somebody trying to speak seriously about some relatively elevated secular matter would open their mouth and immediately half the place would walk out because they're not going to sit there and listen to some Polak tell them what to do or some Litvak explain life to them. And this was a real thing. If you think it's naive, notice that, I don't know if anybody here has ever heard William Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor read their stories, but some of that might be hard to find, but you can easily find Faulkner's Nobel Prize speech online. He sounds like Gomer Pyle. This is not his fault. He's a lot smarter than Gomer Pyle, but those of us who do not speak that dialect have certain social expectations that are not William Faulkner's fault that go along with that dialect. It's the same thing in Yiddish, the same thing in any language. So it's not a matter of correct. And these fights over dialect have wasted, I think, more time more Yiddish cultural time than really they deserve to, than is coming to them.
Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
Any further questions that anyone has? If not, before we wrap up, I don't know if there are any final words that anyone say. Eric, is there anything else you'd like to say about the production and about anything further?
Well, the whole experience was really quite unique and epic in all of its parameters. And I'm obviously really grateful to everybody that was involved in pulling it off. One thing that I thought, in one of our talkbacks at the actual performances that came up was the whole question of why was this work created in the first place? What was the context that inspired Kon and Brodersen? And maybe I remember Michael said some pretty interesting stuff about those two characters in terms of their desire to be pioneers of Yiddish in new realms. And I don't know, Michael, can you maybe run with that for a second? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, briefly, at precisely that point in their careers, and Kon and Brodersen, as we've seen, both became very well known later. This was at the beginning of their becoming well-known phase. And they started doing things. They started a puppet theater in Yiddish, first one. Brodersen created a review theater in Lodz, which was the first thing of its type in Poland. He's basically the pioneer of Kleinkunst, Yiddish Kleinkunst, or theatrical review, Kleinkunst, I guess, in Poland, in Yiddish. And this just seems to have been almost another notch in their artistic belts. Like, we've done this, which nobody had done before. Now let's do this that nobody has done before. Partly, and you got to remember, they were relatively young men at the time. They were in their 20s. They were not established figures. They were they were young revolutionaries almost. Brodersen's theater, which was called Ararat, like the mountain where Noah's Ark landed, but it was a joke. It stood for Artistische Revolutionäre Revue Theater, artistic and revolutionary review theater, right? There's Brodersen in a nutshell for you. I mean, that's the kind of thing he could do. And that was what they were off doing. Because the question has come up, and it certainly came up at the premiere in Toronto at the first night. Why didn't they do another one? And the only answer that I can come up with, given how prominent they later became, or why was this never revived, is they weren't interested for whatever reason. I think, particularly, say 10 years later, if Kon or Brodersen or the two of them together had put their feet down and said, we're doing this, they could have done it. Why they didn't, we don't know for sure. But clearly it didn't seem to hit either of them as so important that it needed to be revived so that it would be remembered.
And thank you, Michael. And just to let everyone know, there's a link that has been put in and other information into the chat regarding a YIVO program that dealt with Henekh Kon's music. Before we end, Neal and Josh, any last words that you'd like to add? Neal?
I just want to say thank you to Mark, to Alex, Michael Wex, Eric, Neal, all of you guys, and everybody that's been involved in this. It's been a lovely ride, and I'm just very thankful to all of you.
Thank you, Josh.
Yes, indeed, and thank you to all of you who came today. And eventually, we will have a really put together video from all three performances that don't have cameras blurring around and things like that. And I'm looking forward to that too. So again, many thanks to everybody.
And to Beth Kramer also. I forgot Beth.
Yes.
Indeed, Beth has been an important force on many different levels to make today happen, and also to make people get to Toronto and to have things happen at Toronto. So while we have certainly heard of Rogers and Hammerstein and Rogers and now Brothers and Cone are things people know, I want to make sure that people know that maybe Horowitz and Wex will try their hand at some other things that can be conducted by Neal to have other things for us to enjoy. So we thank you all for joining us. On behalf of myself and Alex Weiser at YIVO, we really thank you for being a part of this three-part series, and for a big thanks to Eric and Ashkenaz for helping to support today. And we'd also like to thank our supporter for all three events, the David Vickter Foundation, an important foundation based in Los Angeles that is helping us keep Yiddish culture alive. So thanks to all of you for joining us. And I'm not the first, but wishing everyone a Freiliche Hanukkah.
Thank you.